So can you please tell us your full name and today's date for the record?
Patricia Maria Arredondo, and today is July 29th, 2025.
Okay. And my name is Kathy Fay. I'll be interviewing Patricia along with Dr. Jennifer Bazar. So our first question, in other interviews, you have said that the positive influence of school counselors on your education led you to leave your position as a high school teacher and pursue psychology. Can you talk a little bit about this career transition?
The career transition has more context, and that's the part that I want to describe. As a student in middle school and high school, I had two amazing school counselors who today, I guess you could say, were mentors. And the encouragement from the middle school counselor, because I had left Catholic school after grade 8, so now I'm in a public school. And I was actually not very comfortable studying science because we did not study a lot of science. In Catholic school, we did a lot of literary work. Of course, we did religion, and so I didn't have the confidence in science class. So my guidance counselor said to me, Patricia, you could be doing really great in science. You are smart. Your tests show you can do this. And he said, I'm going to talk to the science teacher. And he did, and the science teacher did extra tutoring for me, kind of getting me over the block I had about being a good science student. The other thing is this was a man. I had all had nun teachers, right? And so science and a man and a white man and, all that, kind of conjured up some resistance on my part or, reluctance. But so that was the first one that intervened. And this man, I just want to say, his background was Lebanese. And my mother had known him when she was in school. Not that I think the family was someone my mother's family knew, the neighborhood, right? In high school, my high school guidance counselor was Mrs. Malo. She's a fabulous woman. She was a widow. Her husband had died in World War II. And she was the kind of premier school counselor that I think anybody would want to have as their counselor. And so she invited me to work as her aide in her office, and I became the counselor aide for 2 years. So I would hear a lot of what she did in her capacity as a counselor. It wasn't just telling students about going to college, it was just talking with them and understanding what was going on, and if they had a study issue, trying to understand that. And so she was very positive, she was very empathic, and of course she helped me when it came time to apply to college because my parents had not graduated from high school, and so college was sort of not a known quantity, and let alone going away to school. So she helped me with scholarships and all of those, what you need in terms of being guided by someone else or by someone. And so she truly played the role of a guidance counselor who was very affirming. I was a good student, but you can still have your own doubts. And because no one I knew had gone to college. But the other thing about Mrs. Malo was that she was the best dressed person at school. She always was so dressed. I think she must have gone to this couple of great department stores in Lorraine at the time, Smith and Gerhard and the Style Center. She always was so well put together. She was tall, and she had, you're going to laugh at me for this gray streak, but she had a gray streak in her hair here that I think she might have been prematurely gray, but this gray streak hair, and her hair was wavy, and she always looked like so well put together. And we talked about things, about going to school, and what I thought I wanted to study, and the thing that girls studied at the time was either nursing or teaching. And so I told her I'd be a teacher, high school teacher of Spanish. And then I also double majored in journalism because I had a teacher who recommended that or said to me that I wrote well. And you get those things. So I think that those early experiences from a person I respected then helped me think about what else I could do in terms of understanding, for example, that mental health was a broader area of study versus school counseling, which of course you were doing that. You were guiding students and we were working with obstacles and anxiety and so forth. But then the counseling area is really what came into my understanding later on, because I did transition to study psychology because I really wanted to know more about what helped people function. I also have an older sister who has had mental health issues for all her life, and and understanding, not so much understanding why or her and so forth, but just knowing that I was close to someone who had this, what they called a nervous condition, and you know, what contributed to that, trying to understand that contributed to that. And you know, I'd also heard that a couple people in my family were bipolar, and I just, you know, those are words that people would throw around. And so understanding psychology, the study of psychology and the mind, really, I think I became very interested in that, which meant you know, it isn't that I didn't receive that education when I was preparing to be a school counselor, but certainly it got deeper when I went into my doctoral program in counseling psychology. Counseling at the time, counseling psychology. And the other thing I would say, in, you know, moving in that direction was, as a school counselor, I was working with immigrant and refugee students. I was working with traditional students that were born in the United States, but then we had an influx of immigrant and refugee students to my high school. And I had always been, growing up in an immigrant city, I felt some kinship and some understanding of the dilemmas that they were going through, speaking English as a second language, that their parents, I got to know their parents. And I asked the headmaster of our school if I could have all of the immigrant and refugee students assigned to me. We were divided into 4 houses, as they called us, how our structure at the high school. And so first talked to my boss, and he said, sure, if you want to do that. And then so I went to the headmaster, and he wasn't so sure. He thought it was a good idea, but then I persisted, and so he let it go. So he said, okay, if you're so persistent, okay. I mean, you know, it would harm. And I had checked with my colleagues because the students were distributed to other counselors around the school, and I talked to my colleagues, and I said, how do you feel if they all get assigned to me in Acres House? And they said, sure, and then we'll still work with them, you know. And so I was doing that, and then the man who became my doctoral advisor, Ralph Mosier from Boston University, was doing student-based research. So he would take all his doctoral students to the high school, and they would be doing their research there. And he came around, and he met me, and he asked, he was told what I was doing, so we had a longer conversation. And he said, wow, this is really great work, amazing. Ralph was an immigrant too, so I think that probably got him interested. And he said, this I think would be, have you ever thought of a doctoral program? You know, this is good, this could be good research, he said. Come to see me, why don't you come to see me? And I remember, okay, so just to finish the story. So I go to his office, and so he says, well, why do you want to study a doctoral program? And I thought to myself, well, you told me I should do this. And I thought, so then I had to come up with a good answer, right? You know, because I really like what I'm doing. I think this would be some interesting, you know, new learning, because there was very little research on immigrants, other than what I mentioned to you that I found in the archives and education that was, really just documenting how they were trying to be, marginalized through testing. But I think that was really very key to my moving then into the field and knowing that there was more that was possible. And I knew that school counseling, even then I knew that it wasn't going to be my lifetime career. So I found that this would be then with that encouragement, and he was a great advisor, and he mentored me among other people, but he was my main mentor. I think that was really what opened the door to step into psychology more fully.
So you've mentioned a few people and events already, but is there any, if you had to sort of pick one person or one event that had a major influence on who you are as either a person or as a psychologist or both, could you pick an event or a person? Is that?
It's such a big question because, when you think about one or two or three, and I have to kind of think about this, and I've thought about it over the years, is that my grandmother was a real pioneer in many ways, and I think understanding women through her experiences, so the psychology of women, I think, is something that's always interested me. And understanding how women make things happen, but in my own family, so seeing it really up close with my grandmother, who was an immigrant, who had a story that was just amazing to all of us, who ran away from home at age 12 and found her way to the United States, eventually married my grandfather in the way, but outlived him 44 years. Okay, and so here's a woman who's illiterate, but she goes to work after her husband dies, and she works at the steel mill as a laborer. And then she uses that money to buy her first house. Okay? So I don't know if she just was so smart. I mean, in terms of how she went about her life, very goal-oriented. And here's a woman who people would have discounted because she was like 4'9". And didn't speak English very well. Her English came from the television, right? So she had some funny things that she learned on television. But she was, in terms of understanding a woman's behavior, just kind of observing that over the years and still reflecting on it and recognizing that she transcended obstacles that a lot of people with more education or more, experience would have. But there's something very innate. But I think that act of running away from home said a lot about her determination. And so everything she did had a determination, whether it was buying her first house, and then urban renewal came in, gave her money, and destroyed her house, and she bought her second house. So all of that, observing that, being close to her, thinking about that behavior. And I think because she was an immigrant and I grew up in an immigrant city, always being curious about how immigrants like herself never went home, never went back, and trying to understand the psychology of staying where you are or just not going back. And I used to know in those days it wasn't easy to, just jump on a plane or it's particularly that. And the immigrant students I worked with, they were here. Some of them had left Russia as refugees, Jewish refugees, and the Vietnam War brought some more students. They weren't going back. So all of that made me also curious about what goes on for people when they've had to leave their homeland, where they were socialized culturally, not just linguistically, and then they could come here and make all those adaptations, create new opportunities, not only for themselves but their families. So that always made me curious, what drives that behavior besides, determination and motivation. But I mean, psychologically, what's going on here for people to experience that loss. I think it's a loss. I mean, I used to say, God, could I ever go away and not come back? My parents are here and my brothers and sisters are here. And so I used to think about that. And so I would say she was probably the one we hold up on an altar. And she was called a rebel for doing what she did, which is very cool, right? So yeah, I think she was very influential in my thinking, consciously and unconsciously.
Okay, we'll switch gears here a little bit.
Okay.
So in 1985, you founded a consulting firm, Empowerment Workshops Incorporated, which provided an avenue for you to bring your psychological work into the corporate world. What influence did this experience have on your later work?
Tremendous, because, I was trained, I was socialized to be an academic person, to be in the academy. And when that didn't work out at Boston University, they told all the junior professors, including Ron, that we were not tenurable. So we all had to make decisions. And I decided I was so mistrusting. But I was already thinking about this because I saw what was happening to my colleagues who were older than me, who were there longer. And I knew the shoe was going to drop. So I started thinking about what else I might do, what else was interesting. And kind of talking with friends about the transferability of skills. What are the skills I have? That was the first thing. What are the transferable skills I have that I could do in the classroom but do somewhere else? The workplace is really what I was thinking of. As a junior professor at the University of New Hampshire, I had been asked to be the practicum coordinator because no one wanted to do it, and you're the junior professor, which meant I went to all the practicum sites throughout New Hampshire and got to meet with the directors of those training sites, which was the greatest training ground for learning how to do outreach, for learning how to talk to people you don't know, to looking at the kinds of places where our students did their practicum and internships. So I went all over the state of New Hampshire, drove. And it was, I think, a way that gave me some new skills about talking with people who weren't at the university, who were not faculty, who were not students. And then fast forward to Boston University, where I was at the time before I left to start empowerment workshops. I had a 3-year grant for a bilingual bicultural counselor training program, which is why I had to leave New Hampshire to go back to BU. And all of my students were in sites. They were all high school students, high school counselors in training, so they were at high schools. And then those that weren't in high schools were in clinical settings, mental health settings. So I had to go out and visit all their supervisors. So leaving the office was an important skill, is stepping out into the world that you don't normally operate in. And I got all that experience. Actually, I had lived in Boston up to that point for a number of years. See what year? Probably 15 years at that time. But I had not gone that far in terms of other than the university settings where I had gone to school. And so I started thinking about what might be possible. And talked to my friends, came up with a name, went to a career workshop, and visualizing what I wanted to do. And then at first I thought I was a licensed psychologist. I could practice, earn my money, and then at the same time try to leverage into business empowerment workshops, which is exactly what I did because I needed a salary. And my my practice was a great salary. I did it, in office, the whole 9 yards. Went to the I'll just give you more information than you asked for, to the Small Business Consulting Center, SBA. They had the SCORE, which were the are the retired business people, and they become your advisor, and they tell you how you set up your business and what you should think about doing. And one man said, you know, don't be disappointed, but it'll probably take you 7 years to really be successful, which was a little daunting, but he said it. But I got all of that practical advice for how to set up a business. And then I did it. I got a very nice office, had my clinical work, and then I started pounding the pavement, as they say. Going to places where I thought they might be more open to what I wanted to do, which was, you know, workshops. Workshops on communication skills, workshops on career development, on dealing with self-esteem. That was the most popular one I did early on, you know, improving my self-esteem. I thought, okay, good. So I forgot who I did it for, but, and then I did free talks. And I aligned with organizations that I had never had to align with because they were more professional, the women's groups, for example. So that helped me think about how those skills could be transferred. I knew that I had skills, and I knew that I wasn't there to be a psychologist, but I had all of this repertoire that I had learned in school that was very practical, that you could apply, you know, in real life, you know, how to, you know, be more. I had people who dealt with the anxiety side. How do you manage your anxiety at work? So I got other people starting to work with me. So they would do the topics that I didn't do. And I think this really was important later on because I found I could clearly step into these spaces that were not academic spaces and present well. You know, I have developed good skills in school, you know, in terms of presenting at conferences and teaching. So you know, you're getting in front of people who don't know you, and you learn how to do that without overselling, if you would. And then one more thing that was key in that early year in empowerment workshops was that I was invited to be on a couple of boards that were aligned with education. And Inroads was the name of the organization. It started in Kansas City, and they had offices and programs around the United States. So they had one in Boston, and, you know, somebody tells somebody else, and they reached out to me. And so I got on this board. This was one of the first nonprofit boards I served on. And the CEO of the board was the chair of the board was the CEO of John Hancock Insurance Company. And John Hancock was one of the premier businesses in Boston nationally. So we would go to his conference room for meetings. And I thought, oh, this is a really interesting world, you know, up on the 61st floor or something like that, where when sometimes the clouds would be there because it was a cloudy day, and you know, so we would be surrounded by clouds. So that was a very interesting experience that came as a result of starting the consulting company. And then I think the other was learning the art of networking, because it is an art. You know, how to, as I said earlier, speak to people you don't know and meet people, not just because you want to sell them something, but you have to get to know them and in a different kind of way, finding out who they are, what they're doing. And so those free talks also I gave on women's programs are ones that have consistently been part of my repertoire. The first seminar was called Hidden Dimensions of Personal Worth. And it was about women's hidden dimensions of their own personal worth. So that was one where I then started getting involved with more women's programs. also Wellesley was nearby, and Jean Baker Miller was the director of the Wellesley Center for Women, Wellesley Psychological Center. So I would go and take workshops there, got to meet that crowd. And really some wonderful psychologists were out there. I met Carol Gilligan when I was in graduate school, and she was part of that repertoire that my advisor brought in. So Carol Gilligan as a, an amazing woman. And so all of this eventually led me to moving out of the university with those skill sets. I think some of the best skill sets we have as both a counselor and as a psychologist are listening skills. And really using those listening skills as I try to develop a relationship with whoever it was that I was meeting and trying to understand what they were doing. And then I got more into the nonprofit world on boards, which were all great networking opportunities. And then I would go to some of these events where it was meet and greet type things. And that's where I met my first big client, which was the Gillette Company. And somebody invited me to go to it, and it was in Andover, Massachusetts. And so I went and I met the director of HR. He said, I think she might be interested in your work. I was already doing culture-centered work. They were starting to call it diversity management. And so I met Barbara, who was the director of HR, and the story then starts to unfold from there. I worked with the Gillette Company for about 7 years in different capacities, starting at the Andover manufacturing facility, doing everything you do as a psychologist, assessments, evaluations, then using those data to inform program development, and consulting to he was the manager of that facility. Then they took me to the big facility in Boston to do work there with the HR manager. Then they took me to their marketing area, and so forth and so on. So I had a good run with that company because they had also a CD. They had not only the CEO, but they were very, they wanted to be progressive. And I was there when they started to bring women into leadership roles. And a colleague and I wrote their sexual harassment training program, because they did a study and they found out that it was sexism, not racism, that was the issue. So they said, oh my goodness. So yeah, guess what? So we wrote the manual for sexual harassment for the company, and we trained a lot of people. We started with the leaders, of course, came in from all over the world and did sexual harassment training in Boston. So it was just all of those interesting connections, then banks and hospitals, city government. But it was because of networking. I mean, that's really what I would say, network. And if I take the Myers-Briggs, I used to when I took the Myers-Briggs, I was an INTJ. So, it's just like you can't let that define you, right? So that was that.
In 1992, you published what has become one of the most highly cited articles in the history of multicultural psychology with your colleagues, Daryl Wing-Sue and Roderick McDavis. Can you provide some background on what led to that paper being written?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just so honored that has become like the premier article in multicultural counseling. It's like, I remember, just as an aside, when the multicultural guidelines were published in 2002, right, by APA, I did a presentation with Norman and Nadja Fuad, because we were the co-authors of the leading authors on the guidelines. So Norman came up in his part of the presentation. He said, this is the 92 article. It's the most cited article on cultural competencies in all of psychology, and that was a few years ago. So context matters. My work on competencies was underway before I knew it was underway. And working with the immigrants and refugee students told me that counselors and psychologists needed competencies in order to be effective and what we call today culturally responsive. And I wrote an article that got published in the then Personnel and Guidance Journal of ACA, and it was culturally responsive. What was it? Preparing culturally effective counselors. Preparing culturally effective counselors. I co-authored it with a man who was in graduate school with me. And at the time, I had met Daryl Wink-Sue. Daryl was the first editor of P&G who was not white. So Daryl becomes the editor. And I was a junior professor, so I wrote to him and I introduced myself. I said, I really am excited that you're going to be the editor. I've got this work I'm doing. I described it. And he says, oh, submit it, submit it. So I did, and it got published. So I was talking about the competencies in that article. In that journal article about competencies. Okay. Context, 1982, the first article in APA on cultural competencies. Lead author, Daryl. Alan Ivey was president of Division 17 and said, do this. I think they need to do this. So they wrote it. And it was dormant. It was dormant for all those, a number of years, so 82 to 92, so fast forward. So 1990, Thomas Parham is now president-elect of the Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development. And he comes to me and Daryl, and maybe Rod was there too, but Rod certainly was obviously a co-author. He says, I want you to get that article out of the dust and do something here at AMCD. And he said, you know, my presidency is next year. Okay. I'd like that article for my presidency. We said, oh my goodness, okay. So we looked at each other and we said, all right, let's divide the work. And so we wrote that article in probably 10 months or less. And it, you know, it was, how do I want to say, it was revolutionary. Because a lot of people said, oh, all counseling is good counseling. You know, you don't need to think about culture or ethnicity or race or anything like that, or class. And it got published in both JCD, Journal of Counseling and Development, and the Association Multicultural Counseling and Development Journal. So it was published in both journals. But I remember working so hard because I was, you know, in my business. I wasn't in higher ed at the time. And I did a lot of publishing when I wasn't in higher ed, which is ironic. But I said, yeah, I'm committed to this. I don't know how many iterations we went through. And we adapted it based on what Daryl had started in '82 and just expanded it because we put more context around it, is what I would say. And then we had 31 standards that we put. So it's preparing, what's the title? Anyway, I'm blocking on this right now. Multicultural Counseling, Competencies and Standards, A Call to the Profession is the title of that article. And it was revolutionary because a lot of people in ACA just didn't really buy it. You know, why do we have to have this? They looked at it as a disruption of the profession. And then in '96, I co-authored operationalization of the multicultural counseling competencies because people said to us, how do we do all of this? You have 31 standards, how do we put it in practice? So we had I think there were 6 of us who co-authored operationalization of the multicultural counseling competencies. The key piece in that is the dimensions of personal identity, I like to think. The dimensions of personal identity is what we would call today more around intersectional identities. Because right there, it was all intersecting identities, the ABC model. And it was really built on my work with immigrants. Because people just said an immigrant identity and that's all, it would end there. You know, they didn't look at the people as having all of these other identity assets. So that's where that model came from in '92 and then embedded it in the '96 article. I'm really, I'm always on what do you call one of those platforms? Academy EDU, Academia EDU, ResearchGate, those things. And people will say, you have citations here, and they're based on the MCCs, and people in Turkey and Taiwan, they became used by the LGBTQ group, the disabilities groups, as a framework for awareness, knowledge, and skills. And I'm very, really like, wow. No, I'm proud of it because, here we are, how many years later, and they're an institution, really, in the professions of counseling and psychology. And I did some consultation for a neurological professional group, and they wanted me to consult because of the MCCs, because of that framework. And so I'm sometimes just in awe of the fact of the impact that article has had on the professions, and a lot of professions actually. I use it in consulting, and people buy it. So it's like, okay, fine. I guess it's had longevity, right?
Why do you think, I'm trying to think about the context of that time period.
Yes.
Why did it land, why did it stick? Why did people suddenly listen? Like, what was it about that moment? It was definitely a really important quality piece of writing, but somehow people had to be ready for it, I think.
I think that's it. I think there was a readiness. This is 1992. And if you think about, we came out of the Reagan era, we were in, and so you have to put things in a social political context, right? And we talk about that at the beginning of the article. And we were in the Bush era, the first Bush era. And there were other occurrences still going on in the United States that were not favorable to ethnic minority groups. And I would say that in our association, AMCD, we knew that we still had to make inroads in ACA, which was, a predominantly white association. Number two, I think we all knew that our training was limited. I think that's why the field accepted it. Our training as counselors was super limited. So you are working with a Spanish-speaking person, you're working with an African-American adolescent, you're working on a reservation, you're working in a school in California, and you think all Asian students are like, I think people really were open at the time. Think about it this way too. A lot of folks, well, I was already past my junior professor years, but I was going to say it wasn't a baby boomer group. What was the group that followed the baby boomers? The millennials or the X's or whatever they were. The people were their latchkey kids. I remember that's what they used to call them too. But I think there was a new generation at the time, and I remember graduate students that I had even at Boston University, that would have been about 5 or 7 years. They were all open for something new. And the fact that they had a woman professor, for example, was something that was just at the top of their list. So I think people were in that shift culturally, sociopolitically. I think there was a sociopolitical shift going on. And I'm trying to think of other sociopolitical events that were happening, but certainly I think in the professions, people were already kind of wondering what else, because, all counseling is good counseling. You look around and you have peers who are African American in your classroom, and you don't have an African American professor in your whole career, right? So I think the consciousness, this really kind of raised the consciousness to a new level, and there was a receptiveness, and not everyone loved it. In ACA, I remember we went around to the different divisions to ask them to endorse the competencies. And the last group that endorsed them was the Association of Counselor Educators and Supervisors, which should not surprise us because they're the most sort of traditional folks. But all the other divisions kind of came around and endorsed the competencies, which then led to them being formally endorsed by ACA in 2003. About the same time the guidelines, multicultural guidelines, got approved at APA. There was just a readiness, and I remember going to the conference and people were very excited. And I'm very grateful that we did it. I'm very grateful. We always tell Thomas, thank you. I mean, that's where we have this little clique of Parham, Ivy, Daryl, and me. I mean, that's sort of, and Alan's wife, Mary. But I mean, we did all of that heavy lifting. And it didn't seem, maybe at the time, did you look back on it, it's like, okay, it's like writing another article, okay. But this one just we had no idea it was going to be as revolutionary in a positive way as it turned out. And I think if you read the intro to it, it's really what sets it up for being meaningful. We go back to the Brown versus the Board of Education Act. We talk about the Civil Rights Act and the movements, and then lead up to this. And we talked about the war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson. So we broadened it in terms of the context, and still looking at why people don't stay in counseling. We blame them, but counseling is not relevant if we don't understand the person from his or her cultural experience. So I think that was meaningful.
In what ways have you seen cultural competency change within counseling psychology over the course of your career?
I think what I thought of that question, and I thought of the question, how has counseling psychology changed as a result of the cultural competencies? And I think if we look at what counseling psychology represents in terms of our mission and values and sort of our focus, it's on well-being. It's on health and well-being. It's not pathology. I mean, we always said that about ourselves. We don't focus on pathology. Now we do learn how to make diagnoses and make tests. Administer tests, but more focused on the positive aspects of people. So how do we empower people? How do we bring them up? And so I think counseling psychology has the values that are really centered on people's lives improving. And so the competencies become an asset. If you think about how do I help this, woman let me just say, so you have people who live in poor communities, in rural communities. How do I make a difference in their life if I don't know anything about what rural America is? Or I don't understand what poverty is. And so I think it gave them new terminology, new language, again, new awareness. Not everyone comes and sits in front of me for 50 minutes. That's not a model that works everywhere. And I think counseling psychologists were also in mental health centers, especially college counseling centers. That was one of the places where a lot of folks had their internships. And so they're working with students from different backgrounds who come in with, some degree of well-being, or they come in already having struggles. And I think then you add the ethnicity piece, the gender piece, the racial piece. The gender piece was important because it wasn't highlighted in the 92 version. It was highlighted in the 96 version. And I was very adamant about that. I didn't push the guys on this because we needed to, get this done. If I started adding gender and disability and LGBTQ identity, we would have still been there, I think. It just wasn't, so we just focused on ethnicity, race, and culture. But I think in counseling psychology, there's a recognition of all of our identities and how much it matters to know that in terms of to promote career development, which is big, to look at career development assessments and, what's the difference for women and men and people of color and all of that, So I think counseling psychology is just more positivist in its orientation to people's well-being. And the contexts are also, I think, a lot more variation, but I think so many counseling psychologists are in university settings. They're not at the VAs, and traditionally they might get some training there, but a lot of them move into the classroom also as educators. So I believe that's a big part. If you look at what counseling psychologists are publishing, typically there's references to culture. There's a consideration of people differences. And I think they contextualize a lot more. And I think the field got more open as a result of that. So, and the competencies, again, because the framework is adaptable to different populations and different situations, I think they play a role in it. It's, they don't typecast people. It makes you just think about what is the knowledge I need and what are the barriers I have to do this work, which is your own awareness. So I think it's, again, I look at this as not just a framework, but it integrates very well with other areas of study. That's why when I do consulting, I can talk about culture, the culture of the workplace, the culture of this department. And if I'm working with a group of neuropsychologists, the culture of neuropsychology. So people, they can grasp that very readily, and it makes it a very translatable concept.
You talked a little bit about this already, but can you speak more about the role that your Latina heritage has played in your development as a psychologist?
Growing up, we were, I guess, shaped to be very interdependent, to look out for one another, to respect other people, to take pride in our work. And my parents were committed to us. And so how they talked to us and how they, I would say, shaped us was probably also meaningful in thinking about going into, as a Latina, what are those assets I have? I keep thinking about assets in terms of my upbringing as a Latina and traditions. We were tradition oriented. My dad was an immigrant from Mexico. My mother was born in the States of immigrant heritage, and I mentioned my grandmother, who was also an immigrant from Oaxaca. So traditions were important, and kind of, what's the word I want to say, following a line. I mean, you just couldn't be flipping around, and we were held accountable. But we were, as a Latina in my home, we had a lot of responsibilities, and we had a lot of duties to perform as both girls and boys. There were 7 of us. And so I think that was important to learn how to be goal and task oriented. I talked about my grandmother being very goal oriented, but my parents were very, I would say, supportive of our education. We went to Catholic school, which was a big sacrifice for them because you had to pay tuition. And so the first 5 of us went to Catholic school down the street. And that commitment to education, I think, got ingrained in all of us as kids. 5 of us graduated from college or have a master's degree, and all the grandchildren went to college. All of them went to college. So I think as a Latina, valuing education, learning that the home is first, really. And I think I see that in how our children, are all very committed to the family. They may be in their 30s, but they're all committed to the family. But I think that's how we were brought up, and how that message goes on to those children. And so my heritage has played a role in my development because, I write about this in terms of values, that I learned growing up as a Latina woman in my home. And then how that comes into my work and working with, I was just on a workshop this morning we were doing for a Professional Counseling Association, and the first part of the session was on values. So what are the values? And we worked from 40 down to 5, what are your primary values as a leader? And so they had to work on that. So values, I think, are primary. And also being able, I think we all had to be good listeners at home. We all had to learn how to play fair. I don't want to say I'm conflict avoidant because over the years I've learned how to, engage in healthy conflict, but, we were just not, we couldn't be yelling, and we had to, and we respected our parents. I mean, that's fundamental. That's fundamental. And we had structure, meals and so forth, and we spoke Spanish at home. I mean, that to me is a big gain, a big gain. So we had a bilingual household, and we spoke only Spanish to my grandmother and my aunt and uncle who lived next door to us, a duplex. They only spoke Spanish, my dad's brother. And so all of that, I think, is part of fortifying my Latina identity. We went to a Spanish-speaking church with my grandmother, even though our school was English-speaking. It was a Slovenian ethnic school, but everything else we would practice. We'd have an opportunity. And then with tradition, my dad took us, and my mother too, to the Mexican events. My dad was a leader in the Mexican community, and we learned about our traditions there too, music, poetry, the festivals. So we took part in all of that, and so, you don't lose that. When you grow up with that for 18 years, before I went to college, you don't lose that, and it's in the family. I mean, none of us rejected it. We all, we celebrate it now even more because you appreciate it, but then we didn't at all reject it, my siblings and I. So I think that heritage has been very grounding for me. I think I've always known who I am. Was it a challenge at times? Sure, because I was the only one in a classroom or whatever setting it was. I was the only Latina, I was the only Mexican American, and I prefer saying Mexican American. But, I think that it's become even further grounded, and it shows up in the work I'm doing currently with women and a lot of Latina women. So I think that's, that heritage, is just fundamentally a part of me.
All right. Shortly after your pioneering presidency of Division 45, you helped found the National Latina, Latino Psychological Association, NLPA. What needs in the community were you trying to address? Or you and the group of founders, what were you trying to accomplish?
I would go to conferences and see a lot of graduate students, more graduate students who were Latinos. I would see more graduate students at the APA conferences. I was at Arizona State at the time then, and 99 to 2007, and students came to study with me because of the competencies, right? So, and a number of them were Latinas. And then we actually had more Latino students coming to ASU in counseling psychology department. So I saw those graduate students, I saw them at conferences, also at ACA conferences. There was, because we had within AMCD an interest group for Latino concerns, and they had a vice president. So there was a lot of crossover between counseling and counseling psychology. So I saw this in action. I was in Boston when the first organization was founded, the National Hispanic Psychological Association. I remember feeling very not, I want to say jealous, but somewhat envious because it was in the Southwest and I'm in Boston, right? Well, lo and behold, 2 of the founding members were from Boston. And so they came over to my office one day, Victor de la Cancela, and I can't remember the other man's name. It was a Cuban man. And so they came, they knew I was in Boston. I mean, it's a small world, right? And they came to my office and they said, you know, would you like to start an NHPA organization here in the Boston area? And I jumped at it, of course. And so we kind of dialed up every Latino we knew in Greater Boston, and we started the association, NHPA of Massachusetts. And we had our first conference in 1986 up at Salem State University. And there were enough universities where people who were Latinos were studying psychology, whether it was BC or BU or University of Massachusetts, et cetera. Harvard, there were students at Harvard, and Wellesley, of course. So, you know, there were enough young people, and then professionals too, people already who were practitioners. I was on the Board of Psychology in Massachusetts, and so that, and through that, you know, affiliation or being on that board, I got to know more Latino psychologists who were coming to get board approved and, you know, take the test and get board approved or appealed something. So it gave me another platform for knowing that there was a need. And then when I was president of 45 in San Francisco, some psychologists came to me. They said, we need the NHPA to do something. Would you do something? And I promised that I would do it when I was done with my Division 45 presidency. At the time, the president and treasurer of NHPA were at ASU, ironically, in the school psychology department. So I went and talked with them. I knew them. I went and talked with them and shared with them the request to resurrect the association. Did they mind if I took the lead on it? They said, oh, I think they were happy. And they said, sure, go. So then I had to, shape my new direction. They had started a conference in Rhode Island. There was one in Texas, one in Michigan, and then one in Rhode Island for Hispanic psychologists. But they were more regional, and they were, whoever was at that institution would put it together. But I knew it couldn't be that. That isn't what I had in mind. And so at APA 2002 in Chicago, we had our founding meeting in a hotel room, of course. And that's where we got it underway. And one of the first things that was mentioned, we don't want to use the word Hispanic. I said, fine. I mean, I was in favor of that too, but it was better that it came from someone else. So Ed Delgado Romero said, let's call it Latina Latino. That was okay. So we all voted, whoever was in the room, including Brian and others who've become presidents of NLPA, and we voted, and we just got it underway. Said, this is okay. So people volunteered. I'll be the newsletter editor. I'll take up the mailing list, treasurer. Everyone, internet, whatever we had at the time, listserv. So people just volunteered. And a couple graduate students volunteered too. And it was amazing. It was amazing, but it was very uplifting because everyone in the room felt the energy. And one of the other things we did was to identify people's heritage because, NHPA was very Mexican, or Chicano, right? And I said, okay, who's in the room? And then we found out who was Colombiano, who was from Argentina, who was Peruvian, who was Puerto Rican. And I think that's what makes NLPA so great, is that we have this real multicultural Latine, which what we're calling ourselves, Latinx, Latine, identities in the room. And that's made it a very powerful organization, but I had to do it. I mean, I knew I had to do it. I mean, by that point, I had been already, president of 45. I wasn't president of ACA yet, but I just had to, I felt compelled as well, and I was in Phoenix. So it made it even more, possible. And I had been president, I was president of the Chicano Faculty and Staff Association when I was at ASU. So, there was like, okay, if I can do it here, then I should be able to assemble the crowds. And we did. I mean, it was just amazing. And to this day, here we are 23 years later, something like that. Yeah, who would have guessed, huh?
And you have referred to NLPA as your professional family. So can you talk a little bit about why that organization, you've been a part of many and have led many, why that organization is sort of so near and dear to you?
Well, because it is so tied to my heritage, I would say that's the first thing. I would have, there are a lot of things I would have not imagined possible or even thought about, as a young person, as a graduate student. Other than that, my cultural identity has always meant a lot to me. And I know it has to other people in this academic world I am in. And I think everyone feels like they need a home too. So people who go to NLP for the first time will always say, I feel like I belong here. I feel that this is a place where I don't have to explain who I am. And we created that. We created that space where people will still say that. And that to me is very affirming of why it was necessary to do this, to give it a home, to give people a home, to give people a home. And I would also say that there's so many possibilities with NLPA. You just have to look at demographics as one thing. But our first journal, is, has a really great impact factor. And having a journal, we got it underway in 2013, and I think we now have our third or fourth editor. I can't remember. Lisa Flotis is our latest editor now, and our newest editor. But, that was a dream too, of having our journal. And we knew we had to take some, steps to get there, because the Hispanic Journal of Behavioral Sciences existed with Amado Padilla. And I remember when we actually said that we were going to do a new journal, there's some people who from that vintage, I just want to put it that way, said, why do you guys need a journal? Why do you need a journal? And it just was not a relevant question to us. But I think that's a signature for me too, that of arrival, that we have a journal. I think, and people feel like this is a place where they can share their research. And I think it encourages research that is culture-centered, Latino-Centered. And it's not just about identity, it's a number of issues, whether it's immigration, mental well-being, families, adolescents and adolescent well-being. I think it's just, the journal for me is a signature piece for our association, and makes, source of pride. And when we had our 20th anniversary in Chicago, it was sort of, jaw-dropping, because, for me, it's like, this is, how do you kind of explain this to yourself that this has come about? And yet it has. And I don't want to say, I'll tell you one of the things too that matters with NLPA is I feel like over the years I've mentored a lot of people who have become scholars and who have become leaders in NLPA, whether as presidents and so forth. And I didn't, mentorship for me is like almost secondhand. But in the association, that's a big piece of our value, is mentorship of the second, third, fourth generation. And so it does have that feel of family and I treasure it. I'm sorry I'm not going to it this year because it's in Texas, and it's not a time I can go anyway. But it's that would be the first one I've missed in the whole period. But I'll do the hybrid one. Yeah, it's a place where I always feel welcome. I always feel like I can bring other people along and make them, and where we've tackled issues that are important to us culturally, you know, the Afro-Latino concerns and dynamics, more indigenous focus too, honoring our indigenous roots. So we take on difficult conversations among ourselves. Not everyone always agrees, but I think having an LGBTQ focus within association, that's why our name changed to Latinx from Latina, Latino. So I think we hear people and respect our intersecting identities, because I think that's what NLPA offers anyone who has Latina, Latino heritage.
All right, just a few left here.
Mm-hmm.
What do you consider to be your most meaningful contribution to psychology?
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. Most meaningful contribution to psychology. Elevating culture as a platform for, how do I want to say, as a platform for seeing a lot, for creating understanding. I think culture is such a fabulous concept because it embodies ways of life, personal experiences, values, traditions, and it's hard to dispute that culture has a role in everyone's life. And to be able to talk about culture as one that we all have as part of us, we all have personal cultures, is what I always say. We all have personal cultures. And to understand that personal culture for ourselves in order then to understand someone else. I mean, to me, that's significant. And so I think that's probably, because it's run through my work forever, is the concept of culture and how I've talked about it, and it plays out in different contexts and applications, research. And I think the other, I have to say, the other contribution is that I've had a nonlinear career. And I'd like, especially up-and-coming psychologists, of course, we all go in one direction, but to know that they have a lot that they can do with their professional preparation, that you don't have to have a singular world in front of you, that having a nonlinear career is okay. I mean, it works. There's a lot to get you there, and you don't think about it. I never thought I'd have a nonlinear career, right? This and that, and university professor. I thought I was, my goal was to be a full professor, and then, the train stopped. And so I think it's also knowing that in our field, we talk about change, okay? And I talk about that in all my consulting work. What is the change you want to accomplish? And I think it's knowing that change is possible. Change opens many doors. We talk about that when we do psychotherapy. People come in, what is the change that they're seeking? And so you look at that as a word that has, I think, a lot of power. And so in my career, I would like young people rather to think of their careers as having a breadth, not a single pathway, and that there are other people who can be part of that journey with you. So I hope that will be something that's memorable.
So what advice in particular would you give to a young person who's interested in focusing on counseling psychology?
I would say think about what makes the world healthier, what makes the world more uplifting and makes humanity more just respected. And we all have basic humanity, and it has to be respected. And so, how would you like to enhance the setting you're in? What can you do in that given setting, whether it's a classroom, or if it's a counseling center, or it's a mental health center or a hospital? What can you do here to make the situation better for everyone beyond the work you're doing? Because I do think, as counseling psychologists, I've always borrowed a lot from social psychology. And in terms of understanding people's motivation, people's way of relating, and how we even as counseling psychologists can stigmatize and tokenize, and all those are all things that come out of social psychology. So how can you do that? How can you really respect someone's humanity and make it a healthier place to live wherever you're working? To think about it that way, and don't just think about, I'm here to administer these tests or to teach. Think about what the other greater contributions you can make to the world through your students, through your writing, and through how you work with people. I mean, I really think that we have to look at humanity in a very, we have to lift humanity up right now. And I would want to say that to all students. Think of humanity. Don't think about your studies. Think about what it means to be cared about, loved, and to be, a good human being.
Okay, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you would like to talk about or you would like to say?
Well, I would probably want to say that I'm a very fortunate person. I've had a, personal and and professional life that does this too, right? So I would say that I've had some very wonderful extended family that's been part of my existence, right? And it's not just my nuclear family, but my, my acquired family through marriage. And so that I have, 6 wonderful stepchildren and grandchildren and babies. And then I have great nieces and nephews and cousins. And I think that extended family, gives me a lot of comfort. And that I endeavor to really stay connected to all that family, even though we're all, distant. There's no one who lives in Phoenix, for example. So I do know that if I want to see my grandchildren, I have to go somewhere. And that's okay. I mean, I think it matters to me to do that, to go. I'll be in Boston, so I'll see a couple of the babies there. And so I do feel like I've been fortunate to have an extended family beyond my nuclear family, that we have a lot of love and respect for one another, and I've known them a long, long, long time. And then I have a network of friends that are in different places, like in New Hampshire, where I'm going this next few days, and then in Arizona, where I was for 7 years, and I really built a good network at the university that I connect with. So, and I think through conferences and professional associations, I've had the good fortune to meet so many people who then become friends, and present with them. I have a good friend, Asada, that I've known since the early 90s. And so we're doing a program right now together, a seminar for Latinas. So all of those women and men, people on my consulting team that you see, are folks that I knew through professional associations or some university affiliation. And we continue to do engagements together. And so I think what I guess I would say, I mean, that's something I would add in terms of my comments here, but you know, all of these are meaningful developmental opportunities through your own family, and learning from younger generations what matters, because I have a different generational view of things, you know, and I want to be open-minded, and so I learn. But I think the only other thing is I've done a lot of international work, and I always learn from that international work of culture, since culture is so important to me, how culture plays out, whether it is in Turkey, how culture plays out in Qatar, going there and doing a conference at an addiction center that they were launching, and being there, they invited me to talk about cross-cultural relations. So I think those experiences in other countries always bring me rich learning and broaden my understanding of how culture happens here and how people experience their culture. Just one last story. I was asked to go to Guatemala, and I did go for a number of years to teach, you know, at a week at a time. So they asked me the first year, 2001, I think, to teach multicultural counseling and counseling with women. So I say, multicultural counseling, okay, I teach that, you know. I'm thinking about this. I said, I'm going to Guatemala to do this. This is not the United States where I'm going to be teaching multicultural counseling. I thought, oh my God. So ran to bookstores, got some books, so I could really prepare myself for teaching multicultural counseling in Guatemala, which is a whole other story in terms of experience, but you know, recognizing that this is not the same textbook, sorry, this is not going to adapt here. Just a second little anecdote from that same trip. So I'm teaching counseling women, and you know, just talking about, you know, feminist psychology and so forth. Well, I didn't know that I hit some hot buttons, so the director calls me. She said, everyone wants to get a divorce. I said, what are you talking about? She said, whatever you said in that lecture yesterday. I said, okay, we better come back and figure out what it is they heard me say. And these were all college-educated women getting a master's degree, but we're in a very traditional household and so forth and so on. So you know, sometimes thinking a little bit more about where you are and what you say where you are, I think, is what I've learned through my, you know, international experiences. So that's where I will end for now.
Jennifer?
I did have one question, if I could ask.
Sure.
It's a very quick question.
Yeah.
But you began your interview with this beautiful, like you were speaking about your grandmother, and you shared about her life and the impact that it had on you, but I don't think we heard her name.
Okay, my grandmother's name is Maria Estefania Morales Zaldivar is her married name, Zaldivar, and she was from a village in Oaxaca called Santa Ana del Valle, which has about 500 people or less. So that was my abuela, my grandmother, who never went back. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.